To this now, Statistics South Africa released the second quarter unemployment numbers yesterday, showing a gain of nearly 650,000 jobs between April and June this year. Observers have expressed mixed reactions, saying despite the positives, unemployment remains way too high. South Africa's official unemployment rate is one of the highest on a list of 82 countries monitored by Bloomberg. Red tape, a skills shortage and strict labor laws amid stagnant productivity have been blamed for the reduction or reducing the ability of companies to employ more people. Joining us now for reaction of the business community's Business Leadership South Africa CEO Busisiwe Mavuso. Sis Busi, good evening and thank you very much for your time and joining us tonight. Economists but nationwide were expecting actually that those numbers would show a reduction because of the various pressures that you had to look at here, rolling blackouts, we had the floods, we have all sorts of other labor-related issues that would have put pressure on those numbers. Yet, we see way over 1 million jobs being created, not by the private sector, mostly it's service and some kind of part-time work that is coming from EPWP and such. I mean, what is your takeaway really on what is going on in those numbers?
Good evening and thank you very much for inviting me. So I think what we're seeing is really a positive picture. So maybe let's accept that government policy and the reforms that have actually been implemented recently are going to start giving us, good progress in as far as the unemployment numbers are concerned. Yes, the intervention might have been created by the expanded public work programs, but Thabo, you and I know that those are actually not sustainable. Those are short-term. We are more interested in what is going on in other sectors because I think that is more telling in terms of the shifts that are currently happening in the economy. So when you look at or when you put away the government jobs that have been created, you will see that construction was also a contributor. You will see that trade was also a contributor. You will see that finance was also a contributor. And what's happening in construction and trade is actually a critical component and an indicator, right? Because I think it talks to the ability of that sector to actually absorb, as many people as possible, especially at the level where we need the people to be absorbed, which is the unskilled and the low-skilled employees. It also signals, that maybe, just maybe, some of the reforms that have been implemented by government, which actually require infrastructure investment, are probably maybe starting to pay off because companies are starting to break ground, for instance, in as far as some of the energy projects are concerned. Do you remember the lifting of the license exemption from 1 megawatt to 100 megawatts for self-generation? If companies are starting to break ground, if companies are starting to prepare the groundwork to enable themselves to actually roll out those programs, the effects of it, are the increasing numbers in construction. And I think the issue of infrastructure investment becomes important, precisely from that perspective, Thabo, because its effect is immediate. And we're actually seeing that through these numbers that we're actually seeing. I was also expecting that unemployment was actually going to be higher. So the reduction, even if it's 0.6%, I don't think that we should actually rest on our laurels as a country and celebrate. 33.9% and 44% in terms of the expanded definition is a recipe for disaster. But maybe let's accept, that the infrastructure development and the investment that is actually coming in is a good signal for what is actually going to come in the future.
Labour is lamenting, though, a lack of impact of private sector resources in employment. For example, if you look at the manufacturing numbers, they've actually gone down. We've lost some jobs there in particular. And Labour is saying that's the effect of private sector mechanization. And in fact, that's how private sector would like to have it. More productivity using machines and less people being employed and equals more profitability. So again, all you're interested in as the private sector is to see more profits without putting your resources towards this challenge and crisis of unemployment.
You know, Chaba, what we're going to have to realize and accept as a country is that we have chosen to play on global stages. We have chosen to be an open economy. We have chosen to actually get into the boxing ring with the best of the best, you know, the Asian giants, you know, for instance. So, and Asian tigers, you know, by the way. So it actually means that we're actually going to have to look at how we actually advance, how we actually do things as a country to enable ourselves to be competitive. Remember, BMW South Africa doesn't compete with Mercedes-Benz South Africa. It competes with BMW China, BMW Brazil, and BMW US, BMW UK. So it therefore means, in terms of how they do things, the sophistication and some of the complexities in terms of resources, materials, and whatever other interventions that are being used in other parts of the world, you know, South Africa can't lag behind, you know, because we have chosen to play where everyone else is playing. And when all is said and done, what sets us apart as a country is our ability to actually to be able to compete on global stages. So the conversation we should be having is how do we actually effect a skills transfer? How do we actually ensure that our people are ready for the so-called fourth industrial revolution? You know, how do our people ensure that they still become competitive and employable, you know, in this new era that we find ourselves in? Because holding ourselves back as a country is actually not going to cut it, because we get left behind. And if you get left behind, you know, it means that you may not be attractive for investment, precisely because, you know, the methodologies that you are using as a country are actually outdated, you know. So a UK investor looking to invest in South Africa, while you are still using some of the outdated methodologies, it might not be attractive. So there is that component. But also, Thabo, let's accept that the imports from China, some of the products, you know, that are actually complements to the original, you know, that we have in the country, in this environment where a lot of our consumers are actually feeling a lot of strain because of the petrol prices going up, because of the food prices going up, because of inflation going up, because of interest rates going up. It therefore means people are probably maybe going to opt for alternative products versus the originals. And alternative products are normally the cheap imports from China. So manufacturing having gone down doesn't necessarily mean that the private sector is not doing everything it can. It means that, you know, we are competing with cheap imports, you know, and we're probably going to have to find ways of how we actually get that right in our environment, you know. So I think those are some of the factors. Yeah. The issue that labor is advancing is actually very narrow, and it doesn't actually tell the full picture.
So do you think the government is not doing enough, in particular, to deal with the dumping question, which, again, labor has also raised as part of the challenge, especially, as you put it, in manufacturing?
It is an issue. When you speak to local manufacturers, they will tell you how much the problem is. They will tell you how much difficult it is for them to actually push their product in the domestic market. They will tell you that a big percentage of their product actually goes to the export market because they don't have a competitive environment within which to compete with the China imports, you know, in the South African environment. So the issue, you know, of dumping is a problem. You know, so we really want to have to look at ways of how we actually deal with that. But it's also a very interesting problem, Thabo, because in this environment where people are really struggling, where we are sitting with 44% in terms of the expanded definition, Thabo, where you have more people that are unemployed than those that are employed in all the provinces except Gauteng and the Western Cape. You know, should our people not have alternatives? Should our people not be allowed to actually go for the cheaper alternatives, you know, because really they find themselves in an environment where they really have to stretch their hands, you know? So do we actually disallow the China imports and dumping and whatever cases, or do we actually refine our solutions, our methodologies, our production processes so that we can actually compete with the China? Because China is here to stay. You know, if it doesn't come, if these products don't come to South Africa directly, they are probably going to go to Zimbabwe and find their way to South Africa through Zimbabwe or whatever other channels they're actually going to use. Yeah, so trying to stop China from doing what it does best, why are we not actually looking at how we actually compete at a China level as a country, so that we don't have to sit with the problem that we're currently sitting with. So that dumping no longer becomes a problem. We are also in a position where we can actually compete and actually produce at the same pricing, that China is able to give, that we are actually not in a position to at the moment.
I know you've already spoken about the reforms already beginning to bear some fruits, but are we making the right judgments is the question, particularly when it comes to the stance we've taken on austerity. Is austerity, in simple terms, really good for the unemployment crisis?
One area that government is addressing, Thabo, relates to the country's track record of underspending in infrastructure. So with Finance Minister Enoch Godongwana having confirmed that the public sector infrastructure spending would increase by 30% to 812 billion for the next 3 years, you can see that as much as there might be austerity in some areas, but there is an effort to actually increase spending where it matters. And let's agree that infrastructure spending is precisely what we need, to be able to, precisely as we said earlier on, absorb, the lot of people that need gainful employment at the moment. So I really think it's really a balancing act that government is actually trying to do. I don't think that it's really a full-on austerity interventions. And I think we are going to see the budget, in the next 6 weeks, that an austerity budget is actually not going to cut it in our environment. We need to spend money to actually boost, the economy. Government spending needs to come through. Investment spending needs to come through. Consumer spending needs to come through. So it's actually really a question of how we balance all of those interventions to be able to increase our economic growth, to enable, our people to be absorbed in the labor market as well.
Yeah. Speaking of investment spending and speaking on government spending, is a thing like a national shutdown helping us in any way? Because that seems to believe that will help government speed up the process of investment into the economy.
It is not, far from it, actually. Because let's agree and let's accept that what we're facing as a country is what the entire world is facing. Fuel prices are going up all over the world. Inflation is high all over the world. All of these issues that labor is supposedly marching for, is what the entire world is. And it is not a problem that has been created by government. These are some of the externalities that we're actually confronting in the country, and we're trying to come up with ways of how we actually deal with them. But it was interesting, actually, Thabo, looking at the turnout, of this so-called national shutdown. It was interesting looking at some of the reactions of some of the employees who were actually saying, I am not prepared to lose a day's wage, to go and strike, So I think people are actually in a position where they are making decisions that are actually going to advance us as a people, are going to advance us as a country, and are actually going to advance us as an economy. So I think it shows that we're going to have to try and find ways of how we best deal with the problem that we're facing, because national shutdowns, might have been a thing in 1980, but in 2022, surely, there are other interventions and there are other solutions that we can actually come up with. But a short answer, no. A national shutdown is not the solution, and it's not helpful at all.
Now, I don't know if you were there at that World Economic Forum, but it must have been in 2020 or maybe a little bit, not in 2020, it could not have been 2020, but a little bit earlier than 2020, where they were discussing, if you would remember, the whole issue of inequality quite at length. And one of the issues that they touched on was the use of the fiscal policy, taxes in particular, and social expenditure also coming up. I want to ask the question, are we taxing business nearly enough? Is there scope for taxing maybe business, but even the wealthy even more, so that government can have a little bit more in their coffers to be able to spend on social expenditure?
I think when you're looking at answering the question of whether we are taxing business enough, you just have to look at the world index, and look at where South Africa is sitting in terms of the corporate tax. And you will see that the corporate tax that South African companies are actually paying is one of the highest in the world. You know, so you also want to have to look at how big is this tax base that we actually are talking about, Thabo. You know, you're actually also going to have to look at, you know, to what extent does that maybe also serve as a disincentive for the very same foreign direct investment that we're trying to bring into the country. You know, and I'm not saying that we should not actually look at how business can actually contribute more, you know, into the environment. But I guess it's not really, some of these solutions can be a cut and paste, you know, and I agree with you, the use of fiscal policy all over the world, and especially in South Africa, you know, is going to have to be looked at, you know, to look at how we actually utilize it better to actually change our economic trajectory, because monetary policy has really done its bit, you know, but fiscal policy has to come to the party. And having said that, let me just put it on record that I really do not believe, having said that, I really do not believe that social grants and the basic income grant or the universal grant that is being touted at the moment, Thabo, is the solution. Because you actually have to look at, if we were to look at that as an intervention from a fiscal policy perspective, you know, how do we actually fund a basic income grant, you know, in the current environment? You know, because you can only do it in three ways. You know, you need to cut other expenditure, you need to issue more debt, and you need to raise more taxes. But if you're cutting other expenditure, where are you cutting from? You know, if you're issuing more debt, you know, can we actually, are we in a position to actually do that? You know, is our balance sheet as a country strong enough, you know, to can pay more interest rates? You know, and if you're raising taxes, who are you raising taxes for? You know, because the number of people at the last count, there was only 8 million people that earned enough to pay as you earn. You know, and we know that since that count, a lot of people have actually, skilled people have actually left the country. So that number is probably maybe sitting at 6 million, you know, with the unemployment numbers that we're sitting with. So if you're looking at raising taxes, who are you raising them for? You know, and does it make sense that you're going to expect the 6 million people to actually continue to serve the 18 million people that are dependent on social grants? So let's agree, you know, that as much as we're looking at ways of utilizing fiscal policy, let's find ways that are actually going to boost economic growth. Because it is by boosting economic growth and getting our economy to grow at the right levels that you are in a better position to actually absorb the many people that are actually looking for employment. People are not looking for handouts, Thabo. Our kids didn't go to university to be receiving a 350 unemployment grant. It is helping, you know, in the current situation, but our kids are sitting with degrees and diplomas and at home, you know, looking to be gainfully employed. Those are the solutions that we actually have to try and come up with.
How are we going to do that if, for example, now let's go to the monetary policy where we're raising interest rates and making it more difficult for small businesses to get a loan and get their businesses going. And these are the people that essentially would need to hire those graduates who are sitting at home.
Thabo, remember, how do we grow the economy? You know, not just as in South Africa, but just as Economics 101. You know, you need to change the sentiment in the country to be positive sentiment. And how do we shift the current negative sentiment in South Africa's case in particular from negative to positive is you have to actually enact good policies. Because a lot of our policies at the moment are actually restricting. So once you have positive sentiment, business confidence goes up. And once business confidence is at the right level, investment comes through. And once investment comes through, the economy can then grow at the right levels. You and I were talking earlier on about the fact that the current jobs that have actually been created in trade and in construction are as a direct result of investment. So as a direct result of infrastructure investment, you are seeing jobs being created. And I think what we are doing at the moment, Thabo, through government policy that has been extremely positive for the country in terms of taking on important structural economic reforms, you know, we are actually on our way there, you know, but we cannot effect these reforms, you know, partially. We actually need to enact them fully. We have, for instance, at the beginning of the year, you would remember that we have auctioned the spectrum, but it hasn't been allocated. Yeah. And if you are not allocating spectrum, it means that you are holding up about 6 billion rands worth or is it 60? I may be getting the number wrong. 60 billion rands worth of investment that these telecommunication companies are looking to actually spend in the country so that they can ready themselves for the 5G, investment. And we've also announced the recent energy plan, and as soon as those companies start breaking ground in as far as putting up their own structures and renewable energies. So, Thabo, that is where this thing is. Just put good policies in place and investment is going to be a result. And through investment, you're actually going to get economic growth, not social welfare, not unemployment grants, not the basic income grant. So the focus at the moment in as far as structural reform is the right one. But we actually need to implement this structural reform fully. It can't be piecemeal.
What will be the cost? I mean, you're already talking of the spectrum and 5G. What will be the cost of that particular policy direction where we are moving towards artificial intelligence, machine learning, and so on and so forth? Are we not going to find ourselves in a position where we are creating a different problem called technology poverty over and above the current poverty and inequality that we are dealing with in South Africa?
And we're currently sitting with that problem, not just as South Africa, but as the continent, of digital inequality or digital inequity. And I think that is a problem in an environment, Thabo, such as South Africa, where you have two economies, one nation, where you have huge elements of the first world country and huge elements of third world country, where you have the country sitting with centers of excellence in a whole lot of aspects, and we are gravely poor and very much behind in other aspects. So we therefore sort of need to find a way of how do we actually bring whatever third world elements that we're still sitting with, to be where the rest of the country is, because that is where this is. I mean, the same is true, for instance, if you look at our education system. Are our kids being taught programming and coding, at grade 5, the way the Asian tigers are actually being taught? Never mind coding and programming, are they being taught basic IT skills, at school, and you and I know that it is a function of where you are, it's a function of whether you go to school in Sandton or whether you go to school in Alexander. Right? And the kids in the rural areas don't actually have exposures, in some of these things. So as I've said earlier on, we cannot stop the world advancement and some of the direction, that the world is going in, and 5G is one of them in one of the cases, if we want to be globally competitive as a country. Thabo, we're sitting in an environment as South Africa where 65% of the GSC is foreign-owned. So you can imagine that these countries that are foreign-owned are actually going to want to operate their companies in South Africa the same way that they are operating their companies in Asia, that they are operating their companies in the US, in the UK, and whatever cases. They are not going to double down because they are operating in South Africa. So they are going to bring those technologies, which is good for the country, by the way. So the reason why we remain one of the most advanced economies in the continent as South Africa, and why we continue to be the preferred gateway for investment, is precisely because from an infrastructure investment perspective, we have the infrastructure that matches that of the first world country. So how do we then hold ourselves back, as a country? Because that is one of our biggest competitive advantages, especially from an investment perspective. So we shouldn't be talking about how we hold ourselves back. We should rather be talking about how we accelerate other components of our country or of our economy that are actually lagging behind. We can't actually hold ourselves back. It will be a huge disservice to our people and definitely to our economy.
Ms. Busi, as always, I appreciate your time. Thanks so much for coming on. Busisiwe Mavuso, CEO of Business Leadership South Africa. We continue in a moment. The ruling of the Supreme Court